When will China collapse? That was the question a room full of Western economists asked me over dinner in London. Not if, when. These were smart people, people who read The Economist, advise governments, and help shape global policy. And yet, every single one of them assumed China's failure was inevitable. But here's the question no one in that room ever asked. When will Germany collapse? When will Japan collapse? Notice the difference. Only China is treated like a ticking time bomb. And in that moment, something clicked. The anxiety wasn't really about debt ratios, demographics, or GDP growth. It was about something far deeper and far more uncomfortable to admit. For the first time in over 2 centuries, global power might shift to a country that doesn't look like the West, doesn't think like the West, doesn't worship like the West. And that possibility terrifies people in ways they don't know how to articulate. Think about the Cold War. The Soviet Union pointed nuclear weapons at every major Western city. It was ideologically hostile, militarily dangerous, and openly confrontational. And yet, there was a strange familiarity to that conflict. It was a rivalry within the same civilizational family. The rules were understood, the language was shared. China is different. China doesn't fit the script. It's not Western. It's not white. It's not liberal democratic. And it's succeeding anyway, spectacularly. That's the part that breaks the model we've relied on for 200 years. And once you see that, the panic, the headlines, the obsession with predicting China's collapse all start to make sense. This video isn't about defending China. It's about confronting an unspoken fear in the West, a fear with deep historical roots, a fear that predates communism, predates modern geopolitics, and has a name most people would rather forget. To understand today's China, and the West's reaction to it, we need to go back, far back, to the moment this fear was born. Here's something worth noticing. When Western commentators talk about China, the question is almost never whether China will fail. It's when. When the debt bubble bursts, when demographics catch up, when the system finally collapses under its own weight. This assumption is everywhere. On television panels, in think tank reports, in financial newsletters read by people who shape real policy. But apply that same logic elsewhere, and it suddenly sounds absurd. When will Germany collapse? When will Japan collapse? When will France implode? These countries have faced stagnation, debt crises, aging populations, even lost decades. Yet no one speaks about them with the same certainty of failure. Their problems are framed as challenges to manage, not proof of inevitable collapse. China doesn't get that benefit of the doubt. And that tells us something important. The anxiety isn't purely economic. Because if this were just about numbers, China's story would look impressive, not fragile. It's the world's second largest economy, the largest manufacturer, a central player in global supply chains, hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty in one generation. Those facts don't fit the collapse narrative, so the narrative has to work harder. To see the contrast clearly, look at the Cold War. The Soviet Union was an existential threat, nuclear weapons, ideological opposition, proxy wars across the globe. And yet, the fear felt different. There was hostility, but also familiarity. The Soviet leadership looked like Western leaders. They came from the same intellectual tradition. Marxism itself was a European ideology. It was a fight inside a shared civilizational framework. Even Japan in the 1980s, at the height of American panic, was treated differently. Japan was buying iconic U.S. assets. Japanese cars dominated American roads. There were trade wars, protests, even symbolic acts of anger. But the fear was economic, not civilizational. Japan had adopted Western democracy, Western capitalism, Western cultural cues. It felt like a competitor from inside the club. China isn't inside the club. It hasn't adopted Western political systems. It hasn't converged culturally. It hasn't followed the script that says modernization leads inevitably to Western-style liberal democracy. And yet, it's thriving. That's what unsettles people. Not that China might fail, but that it might not. Because if China can succeed without becoming like the West, then the story we've told ourselves for 2 centuries, that there's only one legitimate path to modernity, starts to crack. And when a story that powerful begins to crack, fear rushes in to fill the gap. Here's something worth noticing. When Western commentators talk about China, the question is almost never whether China will fail. It's when. When the debt bubble bursts, when demographics catch up, when the system finally collapses under its own weight. This assumption is everywhere, on television panels, in think tank reports, in financial newsletters read by people who shape real policy. But apply that same logic elsewhere, and it suddenly sounds absurd. When will Germany collapse? When will Japan collapse? When will France implode? These countries have faced stagnation, debt crises, aging populations, even lost decades. Yet no one speaks about them with the same certainty of failure. Their problems are framed as challenges to manage, not proof of inevitable collapse. China doesn't get that benefit of the doubt. And that tells us something important. The anxiety isn't purely economic. Because if this were just about numbers, China's story would look impressive, not fragile. It's the world's second largest economy, the largest manufacturer, a central player in global supply chains, hundreds of millions lifted out of poverty in one generation. Those facts don't fit the collapse narrative, so the narrative has to work harder. To see the contrast clearly, look at the Cold War. The Soviet Union was an existential threat, nuclear weapons, ideological opposition, proxy wars across the globe, and yet the fear felt different. There was hostility, but also familiarity. The Soviet leadership looked like Western leaders. They came from the same intellectual tradition. Marxism itself was a European ideology. It was a fight inside a shared civilizational framework. Even Japan in the 1980s, at the height of American panic, was treated differently. Japan was buying iconic U.S. assets. Japanese cars dominated American roads. There were trade wars, protests, even symbolic acts of anger. But the fear was economic, not civilizational. Japan had adopted Western democracy, Western capitalism, Western cultural cues. It felt like a competitor from inside the club. China isn't inside the club. It hasn't adopted Western political systems. It hasn't converged culturally. It hasn't followed the script that says modernization leads inevitably to Western-style liberal democracy. And yet it's thriving. That's what unsettles people. Not that China might fail, but that it might not. Because if China can succeed without becoming like the West, then the story we've told ourselves for 2 centuries, that there's only one legitimate path to modernity, starts to crack. And when a story that powerful begins to crack, fear rushes in to fill the gap. To understand why China triggers such a visceral reaction in the West, we have to confront an uncomfortable truth. This fear did not begin with communism, trade deficits, or military rivalry. It is far older, and it has a name that most people today are uneasy even saying out loud: yellow peril. The roots of this fear stretch back to medieval Europe. In the 13th century, Mongol armies under Genghis Khan swept across Asia and into Europe with terrifying speed. Cities were burned, kingdoms collapsed. To Europeans of the time, this was not just invasion, it was an existential shock. An alien force from the east, vast in number, ruthless and incomprehensible. The image that lodged itself in the Western imagination was simple and enduring, endless Asian hordes pouring over the horizon. That image never fully disappeared. Fast forward to the 19th and early 20th centuries, and it re-emerged as a full-blown cultural obsession. Newspapers in the United States and Europe ran political cartoons depicting Chinese people as a yellow tide, flooding Western societies, overwhelming them through sheer numbers. Exaggerated features, menacing expressions, disease, drugs, and moral decay were all fused into a single narrative. The message was never subtle: they are different and they are dangerous. Popular culture amplified it. The fictional villain Fu Manchu became the archetype of the sinister Asian mastermind, brilliant, cruel, inscrutable, always plotting the downfall of the West. Hollywood recycled these tropes for decades. Chinese and Asian characters were cast as drug dealers, shadowy threats, or faceless enemies. This wasn't accidental. It was cultural conditioning. During World War II, similar imagery was used against Japan. Propaganda openly portrayed Japanese people as subhuman, as rats or insects to be exterminated. After the war, Japan became an ally, and the imagery retreated, but it was never erased. It went dormant, and dormant fears have a way of resurfacing. When COVID-19 spread across the world in 2020, hate crimes against Asian Americans surged dramatically in cities like New York and San Francisco. Elderly people were assaulted in the street. The old associations, foreignness, disease, threat, snapped back into place almost overnight. Not because people consciously believed 19th century propaganda, but because those images were already stored deep in cultural memory. Today, as China rises, the same fear returns in a more sophisticated form. No longer crude cartoons, but policy papers. No longer pulp novels, but intelligence briefings. The language is sanitized. The tone is rational. But the emotional core is the same. The West isn't just afraid of China's power. It's afraid of what China represents. A civilization that never fully became Western. A society that doesn't mirror us. A reminder that the world may not revolve around one cultural center forever. Yellow peril didn't vanish. It learned to speak the language of geopolitics. To understand why China reacts the way it does today, you have to understand one simple fact. China remembers what the West has largely forgotten. From 1839 to 1949, China lived through a period it calls the Century of Humiliation. And this is not distant history buried in dusty archives. It is living memory passed down through families, reinforced by education, and embedded into national identity. It began with the Opium Wars. China was forced open at gunpoint. Foreign powers carved out ports, dictated tariffs, and stationed troops on Chinese soil. In cities like Shanghai, entire districts were controlled by foreigners. Chinese citizens were barred from their own streets. Signs famously read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." Imagine that for a moment. Imagine walking through your own city as a second-class person under foreign rule. And it didn't stop there. Over the decades that followed, China was repeatedly invaded, coerced, and partitioned in all but name. Then came Japan's invasion in the 1930s and 1940s, culminating in atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, where hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in a matter of weeks. This wasn't an abstract geopolitical struggle. It was trauma on an industrial scale. After that came civil war, revolution, famine, political chaos. For more than a century, China was weak, fractured, and at the mercy of outside forces. This experience is the foundation of modern Chinese political thinking. Every Chinese student learns this story in school. They visit museums and memorials. They see the dates carved in stone. The message is drilled in early and relentlessly. Sovereignty is everything. This is why China's leadership is obsessed with control and stability, not because of ideology alone, but because disorder and weakness are associated with national catastrophe. When Western leaders lecture China about human rights, democracy, or the rules-based international order, many Chinese don't hear moral concern. They hear hypocrisy. They hear the same voices that once justified invasion, occupation, and exploitation, now claiming moral authority. Even today's leadership is shaped by this memory. Xi Jinping's father lived through parts of this era. Many senior officials grew up hearing firsthand accounts from parents and grandparents who experienced foreign occupation and war. This isn't ancient history to them. It's personal. So when China reacts aggressively to perceived pressure, from sanctions to military patrols, it's not simply about the immediate issue. It's about a deeply ingrained lesson learned the hard way. When China is weak, it is humiliated, and when it is strong, it survives. That memory doesn't excuse everything China does today, but it explains why sovereignty, control, and resistance to external pressure are treated not as policy preferences, but as matters of national survival. For most of the modern era, the West didn't just see itself as powerful, it saw itself as right. There was a story, almost a belief system, that Western values weren't simply one option among many, but the final destination of human progress. Liberal democracy, free markets, individual rights. This wasn't framed as a cultural choice, it was framed as destiny. After the Cold War ended, that belief hardened into doctrine. The Soviet Union collapsed, and many in the West concluded that history itself had made a decision. One political scientist famously called it the end of history, arguing that liberal democracy had won the final ideological battle. From that point on, every country that developed economically would, sooner or later, converge toward the Western model. It wasn't arrogance, at least not consciously. It was certainty. And for a while, reality seemed to cooperate. When China began opening up in the late 1970s and 1980s, Western leaders were confident. Economic growth, they believed, would naturally lead to political liberalization. As Chinese citizens grew wealthier, more educated, more connected to the world, they would inevitably demand Western-style democracy. Capitalism and authoritarianism, the theory went, could not coexist indefinitely. One would have to give, but China didn't follow the script. Instead, it grew richer, much richer, without liberalizing politically. It became the world's second-largest economy. It built infrastructure on a scale unseen in the West for decades. Vast, high-speed rail networks, megacities rising almost overnight, ports and factories that powered global supply chains. It lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in a single generation, and it did all of this without becoming Western. That wasn't supposed to happen. This is the moment where the fear truly deepened, because China didn't just challenge Western power, it challenged Western meaning. If a country could be modern, technologically advanced, and economically successful without adopting Western political values, then maybe those values weren't universal laws of progress after all. Maybe they were particular. This is why China's rise feels existential in a way previous rivals did not. It doesn't just compete within the Western-defined system. It exposes the possibility that the system itself isn't the only one that works. And when a belief you've built your global identity around starts to crack, the reaction isn't calm debate, it's denial, it's anxiety, and eventually it's fear. Because if China is proof that there is more than one path to modernity, then the West is no longer the sole author of the future. Here's where the Western narrative often gets China wrong. The assumption is that every rising power wants what the West once wanted, to reshape the world in its own image, to export its values, to convert others, to sit at the center and declare its model universal. That assumption makes sense if you're looking at history through a Western lens, because that's exactly how Western power has operated for centuries. But China doesn't think that way. Unlike the United States, China has no missionary impulse. It doesn't believe its political system is a universal solution. It doesn't argue that every society should become like China in order to be legitimate. In fact, Chinese political thought is built on almost the opposite idea, what scholars often describe as civilizational particularism, the belief that different societies follow different paths shaped by their own history, culture, and conditions. There's an old Confucian phrase that captures this perfectly: harmony without uniformity. It means coexistence without conversion, cooperation without imitation. You don't need to become us for us to work with you. You can see this mindset most clearly in the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the largest infrastructure investment project in modern history, trillions of dollars spent building roads, railways, ports, and power plants across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But notice what's missing. There are no demands to reform political systems, no lectures about democracy, no conditions about human rights frameworks. China doesn't ask whether you vote every 4 years or who controls your media. It asks whether you want a highway, a port, or a railway. This is why China's rise feels paradoxical to the West. Ideologically, it's less aggressive. It's not trying to convert the world. It's not claiming moral superiority. But practically, it's more destabilizing because it demonstrates that modernity doesn't require Western approval. Countries can develop, trade, and grow without adopting Western political reforms. America plays missionary, China plays merchant, and that merchant approach quietly undermines a belief the West has held for 2 centuries, that economic development naturally leads to Western-style governance. Every country that grows with Chinese investment but without Western conditions becomes another crack in that story. So if China isn't trying to remake the world in its own image, why does the West still feel threatened? Because the threat isn't ideological conversion, it's precedent. China is proving, by example, not by propaganda, that there is more than one way to be modern, powerful, and globally connected. And once that idea takes root, the West loses something it has long taken for granted: the monopoly on defining what progress looks like. That realization doesn't provoke debate, it provokes fear. So, let's bring this full circle. The question of our time isn't whether China will become like the West. That question assumes the West is the destination. The real question, the one we've avoided for far too long, is whether we can accept a world where we are no longer the only model of success. For over 2 centuries, global power has been Western. Western nations wrote the rules, built the institutions, and defined what it meant to be modern, civilized, and legitimate. That era shaped not just geopolitics, but identity. And now, for the first time in modern history, that dominance is being challenged by a country that doesn't share Western history, Western religion, or Western political traditions. That is the unspoken fear beneath the headlines. Not communism, not authoritarianism, not even military competition. It's the fear of losing the right to define the world. China's rise doesn't just threaten Western interests, it threatens Western certainty. It forces an uncomfortable reckoning with our own history, our own contradictions, and the stories we've told ourselves about progress and moral superiority. And when those stories begin to crack, the instinctive response isn't curiosity, it's defensiveness. But history is at a hinge point. The question is whether this transition leads to confrontation or coexistence, whether we cling to the belief that there can be only one path to modernity, or whether we accept civilizational diversity as a fact of the 21st century. This doesn't mean abandoning values, it doesn't mean excusing abuses, but it does mean letting go of the illusion that power and virtue must always look like us. China doesn't need to become Western to exist, and the West doesn't need to collapse to share the world. The future isn't about who replaces whom. It's about whether we can live in a world where no single civilization gets to write the entire script alone. That's the real challenge ahead. And whether we meet it or fail it will define this century.